At 7:42 in the morning on October 24th, 1944, Commander David McCampbell sat in the cockpit of a Grumman F-6F Hellcat on the deck of the USS Essex, watching a number on a radar screen that made the air traffic controller's voice go tight and strange. The number was not 10. It was not 20. It was not a manageable problem that a fighter squadron could intercept and handle in an organized textbook fashion. The number was 60. 60 Japanese aircraft were inbound over the Sibuyan Sea in the Philippines, and the Essex's fighter squadron, VF-15, was already airborne, already somewhere over the water, chasing a different fight. McCampbell had stayed behind. He was the air group commander, the CAG. The manual said his job was to coordinate, to manage, to direct. The manual said he was not supposed to be flying combat sorties. He was supposed to be on the ship. McCampbell looked at that radar contact. He looked at the empty flight deck. He looked at the single Hellcat that was sitting there, gassed and armed, because a young pilot named Roy Rushing had jogged back to the plane at the last second to ask the deck crew to check a rough engine. The plane was vibrating in its chocks. The engine was not right. The deck chief had already flagged it for maintenance. McCampbell walked over to the plane. He told Rushing to get in. He told him he was going to need a wingman. He climbed into his own Hellcat and fired the engine. 2 planes, 2 pilots, 60 Japanese aircraft. The math was not good. McCampbell did not care about the math. To understand what David McCampbell was about to do, you first have to understand what October 24th, 1944 meant on a map. This was the Battle of Leyte Gulf. It was the largest naval battle in the history of human warfare. The Japanese Empire, bleeding and desperate, had thrown every remaining capital ship into a single all-or-nothing attack designed to destroy the American invasion fleet at Leyte and cut off General MacArthur's forces before they could take the Philippines back. It was a gamble so large and so reckless that even the Japanese admirals who planned it knew it was probably suicide. But Japan was running out of time, running out of oil, and running out of options. This was their last hand. And those 60 aircraft on the radar screen were the opening card. They were not just any 60 planes. They were a carefully assembled strike package, 0 fighters as escorts, Val dive bombers, Kate torpedo bombers. They were organized, armed, and pointed directly at the heart of the American fleet. If they got through, if they reached the carriers and the transports packed with soldiers heading for the beaches of Leyte, the casualty numbers would be catastrophic. The American fleet needed fighters in the air over that Japanese formation right now, and the only fighters available at that exact moment were 2 Hellcats with a rough engine between them. McCampbell keyed his mic. He told the ship he was going up. The ship told him to wait for reinforcements. He told the ship he did not have time to wait for reinforcements. He pushed the throttle forward. The 2 Hellcats roared off the deck and climbed. What happened in the next hour and a half was not a dogfight. It was not a battle. It was a performance by a man who had spent his entire life becoming so good at one specific thing that when the moment arrived, he performed it the way other men breathe. But to understand the man, you have to go back to the beginning, because David McCampbell was not supposed to be here at all. McCampbell was born in Bessemer, Alabama in 1910. He grew up in a time when aviation was still a novelty, when airplanes were made of wood and canvas, and the pilots who flew them were either barnstormers or lunatics or both. He was not a natural-born fighter pilot. He was not a dashing young ace in the making who spent his childhood dreaming of aerial combat. He was a methodical, precise, patient man who went to the Naval Academy, graduated in 1933, and spent the first decade of his military career doing things that had nothing to do with flying. He became a naval aviator late in 1938 when he was already 28 years old. In a world where fighter pilots like to believe they were born with their hands on a stick, McCampbell was the man who learned it. He was not gifted. He was not spectacular. He was thorough. He studied the physics of aerial gunnery the way an engineer studies a blueprint. He practiced deflection shooting, the art of firing not at where the enemy plane was, but at where the physics of its speed and heading said it had to be. He understood that a machine gun bullet and an aircraft were both just objects moving through space, and that if you understood the math, you could make them meet at a precise point in the sky without the enemy having any say in the matter. By 1942, he was good. By 1943, he was exceptional. By 1944, he was the commander of Air Group 15 on the Essex, and the Japanese pilots in the Pacific were beginning to learn his name the hard way. His score before October 24th was already remarkable. He had been credited with multiple aerial kills, and VF-15 under his command had become one of the most lethal fighter squadrons in the Pacific. His method was not flashy. He did not take impossible risks. He did not charge into formations solo for the thrill of it. He was a hunter, patient and calculating, who positioned himself with extreme care before committing to an attack. He understood angles and energy and timing in a way that made combat look, to the untrained observer, almost effortless. But on the morning of October 24th, 1944, patience was not an option. The radar screen was showing him 60 enemy aircraft and a clock that was running out. He and Rushing climbed hard, the rough engine coughing beneath McCampbell's feet as they raced to altitude. He needed height. Altitude was the currency of aerial combat. You could spend it to buy speed, and in a Hellcat, speed was life. The F-6F Grumman Hellcat was not the most elegant machine in the war. It was not a delicate thoroughbred like the Spitfire or a nimble assassin like the Zero. It was a truck. It was heavy, powerful, and built like a bank vault. Its 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney engine pulled it through the air like a freight train. It was not designed to outturn a Zero or outclimb a German fighter. It was designed to absorb punishment that would kill anything else and keep flying. It was designed to dive fast and hit hard. It was designed for men like McCampbell. He leveled off above the Japanese formation. He looked down. 60 aircraft spread out below him in the morning sky over the Sibuyan Sea. He could see the formations within the formation, the bombers in the center plodding toward the fleet, the Zeros weaving above them in loose escort patterns. He could see the tactical logic of what they were doing, and in the same instant, he could see the gaps. There was always a gap. McCampbell rolled the Hellcat over and dove. He did not announce himself. He did not fire from long range to scatter the formation or alert the escorts. He dropped from altitude in a vertical dive, the airspeed needle winding past 300, past 350, and he picked a single target at the edge of the Japanese formation, a Naval dive bomber drifting slightly away from its wingman, and he closed to the distance where missing was physically difficult. He squeezed the trigger. The 6 50 caliber machine guns in the Hellcat's wings erupted. The rounds hit the valve at the fuel tank, and the result was immediate and absolute. The Japanese plane did not smoke. It did not glide away trailing fire for a dramatic exit. It simply stopped being an airplane and became a fireball that expanded and fell toward the ocean below. McCampbell did not watch it fall. He was already pulling the stick back, using the speed of the dive to zoom climb back up to altitude. This was the move. This was the discipline that separated competent pilots from lethal ones. Most men, in the chaos of a dogfight, use their dive speed to extend away horizontally, trading distance for safety. McCampbell traded his speed for altitude. He went back up, back to the high ground, back to the position of advantage that the Japanese pilots below him could not match without burning half their fuel supply climbing to meet him. By the time the Japanese escort Zeros had finished looking at the fireball where their wingman used to be and started looking for the attacker, McCampbell was already 3,000 feet above them again. He rolled over and dove. Second target, he hit it the same way, coming from above and behind, closing to point-blank range before firing, using short-controlled bursts that put every round on the target instead of spraying the general vicinity with optimistic lead. The second valve came apart just as quickly as the first. He zoomed back to altitude. Third target. The Japanese formation was beginning to react now. The Zero escorts had identified the threat. They could see that 2 American fighters were tearing through their bombers with surgical precision. They were turning to intercept. They were setting up engagement runs. They were doing exactly what trained fighter pilots do when their charges are under attack. McCampbell watched them maneuver and noticed something. He noticed that the Zero pilots were making the turns too wide. They were pulling too much lead on their own intercepts, telegraphing their angles. They were reacting, but they were reacting with the slightly loose, slightly imprecise movements of pilots who had not been in enough fights. Not veterans. Replacements. The Japanese veterans, the men who had learned to fly over China in the 1930s, the men who had executed the Pearl Harbor attack with cold clinical perfection, those men were largely dead. Midway had killed hundreds of their best pilots. Guadalcanal had killed hundreds more. The Imperial Japanese Navy had been grinding through its pool of experienced aviators for 2 years, and the replacements coming out of flight school had half the training hours of their predecessors. They were brave. They were willing to die. But they did not have the 10,000 hours of sky time that turned reflexes into instinct. McCampbell filed this information away and climbed back to altitude for the 4th time. At this point in the engagement, any other pilot in the Pacific would have been satisfied. 3 kills in a single engagement was an exceptional day. The tactical situation was insane, 2 planes against 60, and the rational move was to report the formation's position, keep the Zero escorts occupied and distracted, and let the rest of the squadron come up and handle the heavy lifting. McCampbell rolled over and dove for the 4th time. 4th target, down. 5th, down. He was moving through the Japanese formation like a man doing a job. He was not reckless. He was not burning with heroic fury. He was methodical. He was systematic. He was working a problem. Each dive calculated, each burst of fire placed with precision, each zoom climb taking him back to the altitude he needed before the Zeros could put him in a disadvantaged position. 6 kills. 7. The clock was ticking. The Japanese formation was beginning to disintegrate. The bombers who were still flying were starting to jettison their ordnance and turn away. They were not making it to the fleet. Something was stopping them, and nobody could figure out what it was, because every time they found the attacker, he was already 3,000 feet above them again. 8. 9. And then the engine coughed. McCampbell felt it before he heard it. A subtle change in the vibration, a hesitation in the smooth roar of the Pratt & Whitney that should not have been there. The rough engine that the deck chief had flagged, the problem that had given Rushing an excuse to stay behind and become McCampbell's wingman, was asserting itself. The engine was not dying. Not yet. But it was complaining. It was telling him that it had limits and that he was approaching them. He checked his fuel, getting low. He checked his ammunition counters, getting very low. He looked at the Japanese formation below him. It was scattered now, broken, the tight defensive grouping shredded by the attacks from above. Bombers were turning in every direction. Zeros were chasing him in disorganized pursuit. The formation that had launched from their carriers as a disciplined strike package was dissolving into a chaotic sprawl across the morning sky. A lesser pilot, or a smarter one, would have taken the exit. The mission was accomplished. The fleet was safe. Nobody was going to argue with 9 kills. Nobody in the history of naval aviation had 9 kills in a single engagement. McCampbell looked at the rough engine. He looked at the fuel gauge. He looked at the scattered Japanese planes below him. He rolled over and dove. The engine coughed again, harder this time. The fuel gauge was moving in a direction he did not like. He had enough to fight or enough to get home. Not both. He made a decision that should have been obvious. He had been making the obvious decision for 90 minutes, and nobody had been able to stop him. He dove. The Japanese Zeros were furious now. They were not stupid. They had figured out the pattern. They knew he was above them, diving, zooming, climbing, diving again. They tried to station fighters at altitude to intercept him at the top of his climb. He saw them positioning and adjusted, rolling out to the side, using the energy of his zoom to extend laterally before climbing again, staying out of their firing solutions by margins that looked razor-thin from the outside, but that he felt with complete confidence. He dove again, and the gun jammed. Not all 6 guns, 1 gun. The port outboard .50 caliber seized, overheated, and stopped cycling. 5 guns left. He pulled out, climbed, checked the other gun stations. Still firing. He could still work. He looked at the remaining Japanese aircraft. He looked at his fuel gauge, which was now telling him a story he could not ignore much longer. The engagement had been going on for an hour and 20 minutes. The Japanese formation no longer existed as a formation. There were individual planes, scattered and fleeing, some already turning back toward their carriers, some still trying to find the fleet but without the coordination that made them dangerous. The threat to the Essex and the ships around her had been broken, not by the squadron that was supposed to be up there, not by the carefully planned defensive rotation that the operations officers had briefed at 0600, but by 2 Hellcats and a rough engine and one man who had decided that the math was not going to stop him. McCampbell keyed his mic and told Rushing they were going home. He turned the Hellcat south toward the Essex. The rough engine ran. He landed on Fumes. The deck crew caught the tailhook and the plane rolled to a stop with less fuel in the tanks than some men carry in a can to mow their lawn. When the crew chief climbed up to check the aircraft, he found the plane had taken hits. There were bullet holes in the wings. The engine was running rough enough that the vibration had cracked a small component in the cowling. The port gun was seized solid. The deck chief looked at McCampbell. McCampbell climbed out of the cockpit, walked to the debriefing tent, and told the intelligence officers what had happened. He was calm. He was precise. He gave them the compass headings, the altitudes, the attack runs, the types of aircraft, the confirmation of kills. He treated it the way a surgeon treats a difficult operation, as a technical problem that had been solved through the proper application of skill. The intelligence officers looked at the numbers on their pads. They looked at each other. They looked at McCampbell. 9 confirmed aerial kills. In a single engagement. On a day when 2 Hellcats had taken on 60 Japanese aircraft, 9 aerial kills in a single combat engagement, more than any other American pilot in the history of the Second World War, a record that has never been equaled or broken by any American aviator in any war since. The story should have ended there, but David McCampbell was not finished with October. In the weeks that followed Leyte Gulf, he continued to fly. He continued to fight. He continued to apply the same methodical, disciplined ferocity to every mission. By the time Air Group 15 completed its combat tour and returned to the United States, McCampbell's personal aerial kill count stood at 34 confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed. 34. He is the United States Navy's all-time leading ace. No naval aviator before him or since has come close to that number. He flew those victories not with reckless abandon, but with precision, patience, and a professionalism so deep it looks simple from the outside. He was awarded the Medal of Honor. President Franklin Roosevelt himself placed the ribbon around McCampbell's neck in a ceremony at the White House. The citation spoke of his conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. Standard Medal of Honor language. True language, but inadequate language, because it does not capture the specific genius of what he did. The genius was not courage. Courage is the price of admission in combat aviation. Every pilot who climbs into a fighter and flies toward the enemy is demonstrating courage. The genius was the science. The genius was the fact that McCampbell had spent years studying exactly what angle, what range, what timing, what ammunition placement was required to destroy an aircraft with the minimum expenditure of rounds and the minimum exposure of himself to return fire. He had built, inside his own mind, a targeting computer made of experience and observation, and on October 24, 1944, he ran it at full capacity for 90 minutes against the largest target set he would ever be given. He did not waste ammunition. He did not spray hope at distant silhouettes. He closed to the distance where the outcome was certain, fired with precision, and immediately put himself back in the position of advantage. Over and over, like a craftsman who has made the same joint 10,000 times and can make it blindfolded. The Japanese pilots never solved him because there was nothing to solve. He was doing everything correctly. There was no trick. There was no lucky bounce of the physics. He was simply better at the exact thing they were trying to do than anyone they had ever encountered. After the war, McCampbell stayed in the Navy. He continued to serve. He worked in operations, in training, in the development of carrier aviation doctrine. He was a Navy man to his core, and the Navy kept him working until he retired as a captain in 1964. He had spent 31 years in uniform. In his retirement, he lived quietly. He did not seek the spotlight. He did not trade on his legend. He went to reunions of the naval aviation community, spoke when asked, shook hands, signed photographs. He was polite and generous with his time and genuinely modest about the record that bore his name. This is a specific kind of modesty that you find sometimes in men who have done extraordinary things under genuine pressure. It is not false modesty. It is not the performance of humility. It is the quiet understanding that they were, in the moment that defined them, simply doing the job they had prepared for. The preparation was the achievement. The combat was just the test. McCampbell had prepared for 20 years before October 24, 1944. He had studied. He had practiced. He had flown thousands of hours and thought carefully about every lesson each of those hours taught him. And when the test came, when the radar screen showed 60 enemy aircraft and the deck was empty and the only available plane had a rough engine, he was ready. He passed the test 9 times in 90 minutes. If this story moved you, if you believe the greatest weapons in history have always been the men inside the machines, hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that stories like this one deserve to be found. Subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive. And drop a comment. Who do you think was the greatest fighter pilot of World War II? The debate is very much still open. We read every single one. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering Commander David McCampbell. We keep the signal alive.